Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a really significant theological question, one that sits right at the heart of the relationship between the Abrahamic faiths.
It's a huge topic, and we've got a fantastic set of sources that are all trying to answer this one central problem.
Right. The problem being, how can the Quran seem to praise the Torah and the Gospel, affirm them, when at the same time, the dominant Islamic view is that the versions we have today, well, they've been altered.
And not just altered, but legally superseded. It feels like a contradiction on the surface.
It does, and this apparent contradiction is something the sources call a shubha, a doubt, or a complex question that's often raised by Jewish and Christian thinkers.
Exactly. Their argument is, like, your own book seems to validate ours.
They use the Quran against itself.
They do. They'll point to a verse that says, how can they ask you to judge when they have the Torah, in which is the judgment of God? Or another that says Christians are the nearest in affection.
So they're saying, see, your book says our book is fine.
That's the core of their claim. But the sources we're looking at today provide a really detailed, multi-layered response, and it really all boils down to two key principles.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is making a sharp, clear distinction between the original revelation, the Torah that was given to Moses, the Injil given to Jesus, and the books that are circulating now.
So the praise is for the original, not the current version.
Precisely. And the critique is for the changes made to the current version.
And the second principle?
That's the principle of abrogation, or nashk. The idea that even if the previous books were perfectly preserved, which they weren't, the final message brought by the Prophet Muhammad is the final update. It supersedes all previous laws for all people.
So our mission today is to really unpack those two pillars. We're going to get into the details, look at the historical context, the textual evidence, and give you, the listener, a full picture of how these sources resolve this profound theological puzzle.
Let's get into it.
All right, let's start in the very foundation. Before we even get to corruption or abrogation, why does the Quran speak positively about previous prophets and books at all?
This is such a critical starting point. The sources stress that belief in all of God's messengers and all of God's revealed books is a non-negotiable part of the Islamic creed. It's not optional.
It's not just a nice historical acknowledgement.
Not at all. It's a pillar of faith. The scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, who is cited heavily in our sources, puts it very starkly. He says that to deny even one prophet that Muslims know of, like Moses or Abraham or Jesus, is to become a disbeliever by consensus.
So you can't pick and choose. You can't say, I believe in Abraham but not Moses.
You can't. It's a single, continuous chain of revelation. And if you break one link, you've rejected the entire chain. The Quran itself says over and over, we do not differentiate between any of his messengers.
So the positive mention of Jesus or the Torah is, first and foremost, the Quran simply fulfilling its own core theological mandate.
Exactly. It's establishing that continuity. And this builds into the next foundational point the sources make.
Which is?
That the religion of God has always been one and the same. It's always been Islam, in the literal sense of submission to God.
So Islam isn't a new religion from the 7th century, but the original state of all prophets.
Yes. The sources are very clear on this. They provide verse after verse showing that this was the state of all the prophets. Moses tells his people to rely on God if you are Muslims. He uses that exact word.
Wow.
The disciples of Jesus declare, bear witness that we are Muslims. Even figures like the Queen of Sheba, when she accepts Solomon's message, she says, I submit with Solomon to God.
So there's this universal thread of submission running through the entire history of prophecy. The praise is for that universal truth.
It's for that essence. Which leads us to the next crucial distinction the sources draw.
And that's separating the prophet from the followers.
Yes. This is a point that Ibn al-Qayyim makes with a really powerful analogy.
The doctor and the patient.
The doctor and the patient. If a brilliant doctor gives a patient the perfect prescription, and the patient goes home and either doesn't take it, or changes the dosage, or mixes it with something else.
The fault is with the patient, not the doctor. The prescription was still correct.
Precisely. The misdeeds of the followers don't invalidate the truth brought by the prophet. So when the Quran praises Moses, it's praising the doctor. When it condemns some of the actions of his later followers, it's critiquing the patients who failed to follow the prescription.
So there's no contradiction in saying Moses brought light and guidance, and in the next breath saying, but his followers later corrupted it and rejected the final prophet.
None whatsoever. One is about the divine message, the other is about human action. And that distinction is really the launching point for the whole discussion on tarif, or textual corruption.
All right, so let's get into the weeds here. This is the core of the argument, the distinction between the original pure revelation and the text we have today. This is the idea of tarif.
Yes, and the sources don't just state that corruption happened. They try to demonstrate it with specific textual examples.
Let's start with the Torah of Moses, the Torah Musa. The Quran describes it as guidance and light.
Right. A pure monotheistic text. It commanded kindness, justice, caring for the vulnerable. The sources point to verses in the Quran that summarize this original message. Things like being good to parents, relatives, orphans, and even speaking kindly to non-Israelites. A universal moral code.
Okay, so that's the ideal. But when the sources look at the current Jewish Torah, the Torah al-Yahud, they find things that seem to contradict that pure universal message.
They find some very jarring examples. One of the most striking ones they bring up is the ritual of the scapegoat.
This is from Leviticus, right?
Yes, Leviticus 16. The ritual involves two goats. One is sacrificed to God, but the other one is dedicated to a being named Azazel.
Azazel, who or what is that?
The texts describe Azazel as a spirit or a demon of the wilderness. The high priest is instructed to place the sins of the people onto this goat and then send it out into the desert as an offering to Azazel.
Wait, an offering to a demon?
From the perspective of the Islamic scholars in our sources, yes. They see this as an undeniable breach of pure monotheism. Why would God, who demands exclusive worship, command a ritual that dedicates something to another spiritual entity?
That seems like a pretty clear violation of the first commandment.
It's seen as an explicit example of a polytheistic element being introduced into the text. Another example they point to is in Deuteronomy.
What's that one?
Deuteronomy 4.19. The verse seems to suggest that while Israel must worship God alone, God has specifically allotted the sun, moon, and stars for the other nations to worship.
So a kind of divine permission for polytheism for everyone else.
It's interpreted that way, a sort of theological double standard, which again runs completely counter to the universal call to monotheism that is central to the Islamic understanding of God's message.
And it's not just theology, right? The sources also point to legal and ethical issues.
Oh, absolutely. They focus a lot on what they see as a kind of extreme tribal exclusivity.
For example,
The laws on slavery and usury. Leviticus, for instance, allows for the perpetual enslavement of foreigners, of non-Israelites, while putting strict limits on enslaving a fellow Israelite.
so one set of rules for your own group and another for outsiders.
Exactly. And you see the same thing with usury, or interest. Deuteronomy explicitly forbids charging interest to a fellow Israelite, but permits charging it to a foreigner.
Which our sources would argue is a form of institutionalized economic exploitation.
Yes. They argue that true divine justice has to be universal. It can't create one set of ethical rules for the in-group and a different, more exploitative set for everyone else. They see this as a clear sign of human tribal priorities overriding a divine command.
Okay, so that's a powerful case regarding the Torah. Now let's make the same shift for the gospel. What's the distinction between the original Injil of Jesus and the Gospels of the Christians?
The original Injil, according to the Quran, was also guidance and light. It affirmed the Torah. It came to ease some of the legal burdens on the Israelites. And it was crystal clear about Jesus' status.
As a servant and messenger of God.
Yes. The Quran has him saying, I am the servant of God. He has given me the book and made me a prophet. And critically, the sources insist this original Injil contained clear prophecies about the coming of the final prophet, Muhammad.
So what are the main problems the sources identify in the Gospels we have today?
They point to several big issues. First is just the matter of authorship and coherence.
Meaning they weren't written by Jesus himself.
Not only that, but the sources cite Christian scholars who themselves admit that the Gospels are collections of oral traditions written down decades later, each from the author's own perspective. They're not a single divinely dictated text.
There's a human filter right from the start.
A very strong one. And this, they argue, is where the major theological innovations creep in. The most obvious one is the title, Son of God.
Which is seen as a move away from pure monotheism.
A huge move. But they argue it goes even deeper than just a title. They talk about the doctrine of hulul, or indwelling.
Okay, hulul. Can we just define that for a second? Is that like an indwelling?
That's a perfect way to put it. It's the concept that the divine essence of God can physically dwell inside a human being. The sources point to the verse in John where Jesus says, "The Father who dwells in me, he does the works."
And why is that so problematic from this perspective?
Because the sources argue this isn't a concept from prophetic monotheism. It's an ancient pagan idea. You see it in Indian, Egyptian, and Greek myths all the time, gods taking on human form, dwelling within people. But for Islamic theology, God is absolutely transcendent, separate from his creation. The idea of him physically indwelling in a person is impossible.
So they're arguing that a foreign pagan theological structure was grafted onto the original message of Jesus.
That's the essence of the argument. And then there are the legal contradictions.
The Quran says Jesus came to make things easier.
Right, to alleviate some of the burdens. But the sources point to the passage on divorce in the Gospel of Matthew,
Where he makes it much stricter.
much stricter. The Torah allowed for divorce for various reasons, but in Matthew, Jesus appears to make it almost impossible, except in the case of adultery. The sources even quote Christian scholars who call this a clear refutation of the law of Moses.
So if he came to ease burdens, why would he make such a fundamental law harder? It's a contradiction.
It's seen as a major textual problem, but perhaps the most definitive proof of corruption for the sources is the argument of failed prophecy.
This one is huge.
It's a massive point. They cite Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about the end of the world. He describes all these cosmic signs, the Son of Man appearing in the clouds.
The standard apocalyptic imagery.
Right. But then he says something incredibly specific. He says all of these things will happen before the generation that was listening to him passed away.
Within their lifetime.
Within their lifetime. And the sources say, look, that generation passed, and then another, and another. Dozens of generations have passed. The world didn't end.
So a divinely inspired book cannot contain a prophecy that has so clearly failed.
It simply can't. If the prediction failed, the text recording it has to be flawed. There's no way around it.
This all leads directly to the Quran's own statements about this process of tarif.
It does. The Quran is very explicit. It accuses scholars among the people of the book of forgetting parts of the message, of changing words from their proper places. And this is the most serious charge of writing books with their own hands and then claiming this is from God.
That's not an accidental error. That's deliberate forgery.
It's a charge of deliberate forgery for personal gain, to exchange it for a small price, as the verse says. And this is why the sources bring up that famous hadith, the narration from the prophet.
The one that says, don't believe them, but don't disbelieve them either.
Exactly. It perfectly captures this state of a text that is a mix of truth and falsehood. You can't accept it wholesale because it's been corrupted. But you can't reject it wholesale either because it still contains remnants of the original divine message.
There's a really elegant theological explanation for why this happened, which revolves around two different concepts of preservation.
Yeah.
Hifz and istifaz. Can you unpack that?
This is a beautiful point. The sources explain that for the Quran, God himself took direct responsibility for its preservation. That's hifz. He guaranteed it would never be corrupted.
Okay.
But for the earlier scriptures, God did something different. He entrusted their preservation to human beings, to the rabbis, the priests, the scholars. That's istifaz.
So he made it their job to protect the text.
He did. The verse in the Quran says they were entrusted with the book of God. The ability of God to preserve it was never in question, but he chose to make it a test of their stewardship. And when those human trustees failed out of greed or political pressure or tribalism, the text became corrupted.
So the failure is a human failure, not a failure of God's power.
Exactly. It resolves the whole issue. It's not that God was unable to protect the Torah and gospel. It's that he gave that responsibility to humanity, and humanity in this case failed that test.
Okay, so now that we've established this fundamental distinction between the original revelation and the current altered text, we can really dig into the specific verses that the people of the book use to make their case.
Right. We can tackle their claims head on using the context that the sources provide.
Let's start with the big one. Claim 1, the idea of judicial validation from Surah Al-Ma'idah. The verse says, how can they make you judge when they have the Torah, in which is the judgment of God?
This is their star witness, so to speak. They say, look, the Quran itself says our Torah contains God's judgment.
But the sources argue this is a complete misreading. It's not an affirmation, it's a reprimand.
A sharp reprimand, a rhetorical question exposing their hypocrisy. And the historical context, which the sources detail, is absolutely crucial to understanding this.
There are two key stories here. Let's start with the one about the punishment for adultery, the stoning, or Raj Bradim.
Right. So the situation in Medina was that the Jewish tribes knew that the original punishment for adultery in the Torah was death by stoning. But they had a problem.
What was the problem?
The elite, the wealthy and powerful among them didn't want to be subject to such a severe punishment. So they had quietly, among themselves, changed the law to something lighter flogging and public humiliation.
So when a case came up involving someone important, they didn't want to apply their own law.
Exactly. So they brought the case to the Prophet Muhammad. Their plan was, let's see what he says. Maybe his ruling will be lenient, and then we can use his judgment to justify our own change to the law.
They weren't seeking truth. They were shopping for a ruling that fit their preference.
That's precisely it. But the Prophet knew something was off. He challenged them. He said, "Bring me your Torah." The sources say they brought it, and one of their scholars tried to cover the specific verse about stoning with his hand.
He physically tried to hide it.
He did, but Abdullah ibn Salam, a prominent rabbi who had converted to Islam, was there. He saw it and called him out. He said, "Lift your hand." And when he did, there it was, the verse commanding stoning. They were caught red-handed, concealing a law from their own book.
That changes everything. So when God says, how can they ask you to judge when they have the Torah? It's not a statement of praise.
It's an exclamation of astonishment. It's God saying, are you serious? You have the true law right there in front of you, a law you are deliberately hiding, and you have the audacity to come ask for a different judgment just because it suits you.
So the reference to the judgment of God is to the true law they were hiding, not to their corrupted practice.
Exactly. And the second case study about blood money shows the exact same pattern.
This involved two different Jewish tribes in Medina.
Yes, one was powerful and one was weaker. The powerful tribe had imposed an unequal system. If one of their members killed someone from the weaker tribe, the blood money was, say, 50 units. But if someone from the weaker tribe killed one of them, the penalty was double, 100 units.
Based purely on status.
Purely on power dynamics. So again, they came to the prophet. The weaker tribe wanted him to enforce the true law, which they knew commanded equality. The powerful tribe wanted him to uphold their unjust preferential system.
So once again, they were just using him as a tool to try and validate their own self-interest.
Yes. Both stories show the verse as a condemnation of their inconsistency and their desire to follow their own whims, not a validation of their texts.
Let's move to claim 2. This is the verse about Christians being nearest in affection because they have humble priests and monks. It's often used to argue that Christianity is somehow a more favored path.
The sources are very careful with this verse. They describe the praise here as being relative, conditional, and qualitative.
Okay, let's break that down. What does relative mean here?
It's relative to the other two groups mentioned in the verse, the Jews and the polytheists. The sources, like Ibn Taymiyyah, suggest that historically the animosity from the Jews was often more intense because they felt that the mantle of prophethood, which they saw as their exclusive right, had been taken from them.
So it's not saying Christians are objectively good, just that they're less hostile than the other groups mentioned.
Precisely. It's a comparative statement about disposition, not a blanket approval of their theology.
And what about conditional?
This is the most important part. You have to read the very next verses. The praise is for those who possess humility, because that humility makes them open to the truth. And the verses that follow describe what happens when they hear the truth, that is, the Quran. They recognize it, their eyes fill with tears, and they say, "Our Lord, we have believed, so register us with the witnesses."
So the ultimate praise and the promise of salvation is only for those who take that next step and accept the final message.
Exactly. As one of the scholars, Al-Qarafi, puts it, having noble traits like humility doesn't change the fact that if you die without accepting the final prophet, you are still considered a disbeliever. The condition for salvation is acceptance.
That makes sense. Okay, claim 3 from Surat Al-Imran, where God tells Jesus he will make his followers above those who disbelieved until the day of resurrection. The question is, who are the true followers?
This is a great point of interpretation. Al-Qarafi argues it's impossible for this promise to apply to those who later innovated ideas like the Trinity or called Jesus the Son of God, which the Quran considers blasphemy.
So who does it apply to?
The true followers are, first, the original disciples, the Hawariyun, who held to pure monotheism, and then, by extension, it applies to the Muslims.
Why the Muslims?
Because Muslims are the ones who truly follow the original message of Jesus. They honor him as a mighty prophet without exaggerating his status into divinity and without rejecting him as the Jews did. They hold the balanced, correct view, so they are the ones who truly carry his legacy and are thus exalted above those who disbelieve.
Well, let's jump ahead to a fascinating one, claim 5. This is a literary argument about the order of words in a verse that defends places of worship. It lists monasteries, churches, and synagogues before it mentions mosques.
Right. And the argument is, see, our places of worship are mentioned first, so they must have priority or be more honored.
But the sources say this is based on a misunderstanding of Arabic rhetoric.
A complete misunderstanding. They explain a rhetorical device called taraki, which literally means climbing up or ascending.
So it's the opposite of what we might assume in English, where we often list the most important thing first.
Exactly. In taraki, you build from the lesser to the greater to create a climactic effect. So the sources argue the order is actually a progression of importance. A monastery with maybe one monk, then churches and synagogues with the community, and finally, mentioned last as the pinnacle, the mosques, the sites of pure, universal, monotheistic worship.
So the structure is actually designed to elevate the mosque as the highest of them all.
That's the argument. And they add that the description in the verse in which the name of God is much remembered applies most perfectly to the mosques. And if it applies to the others, it only refers to their original state before they became places where, from an Islamic perspective, polytheism was practiced.
Okay, what about Claim 6, the exaltation of Jesus and Mary? The Quran praises Mary's purity and says Jesus was supported by the Holy Spirit. The claim is this proves his divinity.
The response from sources like Ibn Taymiyyah is that the praise is absolutely true, but the conclusion is false. It doesn't imply divinity. First, they clarify that the Holy Spirit, the Ruh al-Qudus, is unambiguously identified in the Quran as the angel Gabriel.
So it's not a person of a trinity.
No. And the act of being supported by the Holy Spirit isn't unique to Jesus either. This divine support, or ta'yid, was given to others. The sources mention the disciples and even one of the Prophet Muhammad's companions, a poet named Hassan ibn Thabit, who was said to be supported by the Holy Spirit when he defended Islam with his poetry.
So it's a form of divine aid given to righteous people, not a sign of being divine yourself.
Exactly. It's a mark of honor, not a fusion of the human and the divine.
That brings us to one of the most, well, audacious claims, Claim 9. This is where some from the people of the book try to claim that the opening verses of Surat al-Baqarah, one of the most famous passages in the Quran, are actually about them.
It is a bold claim. They argue that when the verse says that book, it's referring to the gospel, and when it describes the pious ones who believe in the unseen and established prayer, it's describing Christians.
How do the sources dismantle this?
On multiple levels. First, linguistically, the demonstrative pronoun that, dalika, is often used in the Quran to refer to the Quran itself with a sense of grandeur. The context makes it clear it's talking about the revelation being sent to Muhammad.
But the real takedown is in the description of the pious ones, the mudakin.
That's the decisive point. The verse gives a very specific definition. It says they perform the salat, the ritual prayer, and the sources say, let's be clear what salat is. It's a specific ritual with purification, specific postures like bowing and prostration, all while facing a specific direction, the Kaaba.
Which Christians do not do.
They simply do not. Their form of prayer is completely different. Furthermore, other verses in the Quran describe the people of the book as those who must pay the jizya tax precisely because they are not believers in the Islamic sense. The Quran's own internal logic makes it impossible for them to be the mudakin described in this verse.
So the text itself refutes their interpretation.
It does, very clearly.
Now we've reached the final and perhaps the most powerful argument from the Islamic sources. This is the principle of abrogation, naskh.
Yes, and this is where the conversation shifts. The argument is no longer just about whether the previous texts were corrupted. The argument now is that even if, for the sake of discussion, they were perfectly pristine,
It wouldn't matter.
it wouldn't matter because the arrival of the final prophet with the final revelation makes that new law binding on all of humanity.
And the basis for this is a concept the sources call the covenant of the prophets. What is that?
This is a truly profound idea from Surat Al-Imran. The sources explain that God took a sacred binding oath from every single prophet he ever sent, from Adam all the way to Jesus.
An oath from the prophets themselves. What did they swear to?
They swore that if another messenger, and the context makes it clear this is specifically referring to Muhammad, came during their lifetime or to their people after them, they were obligated to believe in him and to support him.
Wait, so Moses and Jesus themselves would have been required to follow Muhammad if they had been alive in the 7th century.
That is the explicit interpretation from major scholars like Ibn Abbas. The covenant means that every prophet and every one of their followers is bound by this oath. To turn away from the final prophet after he appears is to break that primordial covenant with God.
That's an incredible concept. It establishes a hierarchy of revelation, with the final one being supreme.
It makes Muhammad the seal of the prophets, the Khatam al-Anbiya. His message isn't just for the Arabs, it's universal. And the sources cite a very powerful hadith to back this up.
Which one is that?
The prophet says, "By the one in whose hand is my soul, no one of this nation, Jew or Christian, hears of me and then dies without believing in what I was sent with, except that he will be among the people of the fire."
That's unequivocal. It removes any possibility of saying, I'm fine just following my old book. The act of hearing about the final message creates a new, binding obligation.
An inescapable one. And this all ties back to that word we discussed earlier, muhaimin.
The Quran being a muhaimin over the previous books.
Yes. From Surat al-Ma'idah. The word means it's a guardian, a witness, and a judge. So the Quran does three things. It confirms the original truth that remains in the old books. It judges and exposes the parts that were corrupted. And, crucially for this section, it abrogates the old laws and establishes the final binding law.
So at the end of the day, the ultimate authority is the muhaimin, the final preserved book. The software update has been released, and it's mandatory for all users.
That's a perfect analogy. You can't keep running the old, unsupported operating system.
So after all this, after making a very strong case for both corruption and abrogation, the sources do something fascinating. They circle back and say that despite the corruption, you can still find clear prophecies of Muhammad in the Bible today.
It's a brilliant final stroke in their argument. It's as if to say the corruption was extensive, but it wasn't total. God, in his wisdom, allowed traces of the original truth to survive as a proof against those who would later deny it.
So the text itself contains the seeds of its own supersession.
Exactly. The very book they hold on to contains signs pointing to the man they reject.
Let's go through some of them. Prophecy 1 from Deuteronomy. God promising to raise a prophet from the midst of their brethren, like you, Moses.
This one is full of clues. First, from their brethren. The sources argue this can't mean from the Israelites themselves because the text would have just said from among you. Brethren refers to their cousins, the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs.
And the phrase, like you, Moses.
This is also key. What was Moses like? He was a lawgiver. He brought a comprehensive legal and social code. He was a political leader and a warrior. The sources argue this fits Muhammad perfectly, perhaps even more so than Jesus, whose mission was more focused on spiritual renewal. And the prophecy says, God will put my words in his mouth, which is a perfect description of the Quran's oral revelation.
Okay, what's the next one? Prophecy 2, also from Deuteronomy, about God provoking Israel with a non-people.
This is a verse where God is angry with the Israelites for turning to idols, and he says he will make them jealous with a non-people. With a foolish nation I will provoke them.
And the foolish nation is?
The Arabs, from the perspective of the Israelites at the time, who saw themselves as the sole inheritors of divine knowledge and viewed the Arabs as unlearned and outside the covenant. The sources say this is the fulfillment. God chose this non-people to carry the final universal message, thereby vexing those who thought prophethood was their exclusive property.
Prophecy 3 is a geographical one, from Paran.
Yes, Deuteronomy 33. It describes a vision of God's glory manifesting in a sequence. It says God came from Sinai and dawned from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran.
So it's a progression of locations.
A clear progression. Sinai is universally associated with Moses. Seir is a mountain range near Palestine, associated with Jesus. And Paran. The sources identify Paran as the mountainous region in Arabia where Ishmael's descendants settled, near Mecca.
So it's a prophetic map of revelation. Moses, then Jesus, then Muhammad.
Shining forth, blazing from the land of the Arabs. It's a remarkable verse.
And then we have the one from the New Testament about the expectation of the prophet.
This one is so powerful. In the Gospel of John, the Jewish authorities send a delegation to question John the Baptist. They don't just ask him one question. They ask him three very specific questions.
Are you the Christ? Are you Elijah?
And are you the prophet? That third one is key. It shows they were expecting three distinct figures. John says no to all three. Now later, Jesus implies that John the Baptist was the return of Elijah. So that leaves one figure still to come after Jesus.
The prophet.
The prophet. A specific, singular figure they were all waiting for, who was neither the Messiah nor Elijah. And the sources say that can only be Muhammad.
And this all traces back to the very beginning, to the promise made to Abraham about Ishmael.
Yes, Prophecy 5 from Genesis. God's promise to Abraham regarding his son Ishmael. He says, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly, and I will make him a great nation.
And that great nation, the Arabs, is the nation from which the final prophet would arise.
It's the fulfillment of that primordial promise. It brings the entire prophetic story full circle, right back to the patriarch Abraham and his two sons, showing how God's plan encompassed both branches of his family. It's a very satisfying conclusion to the argument.
So we've come to the end of this deep dive. And if we were to boil it all down, the key takeaway is that the Quran's praise for the Torah and Gospel is very specific. It's an affirmation of the original, pure, monotheistic message that was given to Moses and Jesus.
It is absolutely not an endorsement of the texts as they exist today, and the sources gave us two main tools to understand why. First, the detailed textual critique, the concept of tarif, showing where pagan ideas, tribal laws, and even failed prophecies crept into the text.
And second, the definitive legal principle of naskh, or abrogation. The idea that the final revelation, the Quran, is the muhaimin, the final judge and lawgiver, and that its authority is binding on everyone.
At the end of the day, the entire argument really comes down to one simple act: distinguishing the infallible truth of God's prophets from the very fallible, often self-serving actions of their later followers.
Right. The question isn't, why doesn't the Quran respect your books? The question the sources are posing is, why did your ancestors alter the books, and why won't you now accept the final corrected edition?
And the sources do spend a lot of time digging into the why. The motivations for these changes: political power, making laws easier for the elite, tribal pride, financial gain.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If we accept the premise of the sources, that God's core message of submission, justice, and pure monotheism has been consistent throughout history, what is it about us, about human nature, that repeatedly leads communities to trade that clear, unambiguous truth for something more complicated, more compromised, and more culturally convenient?
What pressures, social, political, personal, are so powerful that they can lead people to alter the very word of God? That tension between the purity of the divine message and the complexities of human society seems to be the central drama of religious history itself.
A question to reflect on. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.